You've probably seen those movies about medieval times. You know, dirty peasants, sure, but the sun still shines, crops still grow, people still manage. Here's what they don't show you. What if the sun just stopped? Not completely. But what if one morning you woke up and the sun was a dim, sickly blue? What if it barely cast enough light to see your hand in front of your face? And what if this lasted not for a day or a week, but for 18 straight months? Most people think living in medieval times was hard. They have no idea. In the year 536 CE, something happened that was so catastrophic, so beyond comprehension, that historians now call it the absolute worst year to be alive in human history. A mysterious fog rolled across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, blocking out the sun and turning day into a permanent, eerie twilight. And the worst part, nobody knew why. Nobody knew when it would end, and absolutely nobody was prepared for what came next. So yeah, tonight we're going there. But before we do, get cozy. Like, actually cozy. Pillows good? Blanket situation handled? Perfect. Trust me on this one. Alright, congratulations. You just woke up in the lands we now call France. It's March of the year 536. You're on a straw mattress? And no, it's not memory foam. This thing is basically a sack stuffed with whatever your family could gather last autumn. It crinkles, it pokes you, and it's definitely home to a few insects you've just learned to ignore. But you can already tell something's wrong. Usually, dawn brings at least some light through the cracks in your little timber house. Today, nothing. The rooster crowed, but the light hasn't followed. Your father is already at the door, peering outside with a confused look on his face. He shakes his head. Come look. You step outside, and that's when you see it. The sky is wrong. It's morning, but it looks like late dusk. And the sun, what you can see of it is blue. Not yellow, not orange. Blue. And it's dim, like a full moon. There are no shadows. You look down at your own feet, standing in a field you're supposed to be planting, and you cast no shadow. It's one of the most unnerving things you've ever seen. And you're not alone in thinking this. Halfway across the world, a Roman statesman named Cassiodorus is writing this exact same thought down, saying, "We marvel to see no shadows of our bodies at noon." Over in Constantinople, the great Byzantine historian Procopius is describing it perfectly. The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year. This wasn't a weather event. It was a terrifying, silent, global event. People start getting scared. The birds are quiet, totally confused by the false dusk. The village elder, a woman who keeps the old stories, starts chanting prayers, begging the sun god to come back. Some people start whispering about Ragnarok, the Fimbulwinter, that great, terrible winter from the Norse stories that was supposed to precede the end of the world. It's a terrifying thought, but as days turn into weeks with no change, it starts to feel like a terrifying possibility. You have no idea that a volcano thousands of miles away in Iceland has just burped a colossal plume of ash into the atmosphere, wrapping the northern hemisphere in a shroud. All you know is that the eye of the world has closed, and you've been plunged into a cold, gray, and deeply frightening darkness. It did not take long for you to realize that the strange dimness of the sky was no fleeting fog or passing storm. Morning never truly came. The light that filtered through the low, choked heavens resembled twilight far more than dawn. Pale and gray, tinged with an eerie brass hue, it left no warmth, no clarity, only a cold and haunting stillness across the land. The birds did not sing. Trees stood motionless, not out of calm but as if stunned into silence. Even the air itself seemed hesitant, as though the very world had exhaled a long, heavy breath and had forgotten how to breathe it back in. You awoke that morning, or at least you assumed it was morning still, adjusting to the rough mat of straw beneath you, the scratch of your borrowed wool tunic, and the rhythmic wheezing of the man sleeping beside you in the communal hut. He had offered you space the night before without question. There were no introductions, only tired eyes and quiet nods. In this world, it seemed hospitality was offered with weary resignation, not cheer. When you stepped outside, the village looked as though it had been dipped in ash. Soot and fine dust hung in the air, coating every surface in a ghostly film. Children wandered with red eyes and chapped lips. The adults, more stoic, carried on with their daily tasks, though slower now, cautious, as if wary of the sky itself. In this twilight, time lost meaning. There was no sharp division between morning and afternoon, between noon and dusk. The sun, an anemic disk shrouded behind layers of gloom, barely shifted in the sky. You could look directly at it without blinking. The elders called it the year the sun disappeared. You were told in low voices that the darkness had lasted for months already. Some said it began with fire in distant lands. Others blamed volcanoes, or the wrath of God, or perhaps the death of the sky itself. Whatever the cause, it had spread across the earth like a slow infection, dimming every corner of the world, smothering the crops, and chilling the soil. A man named Gaius, with a heavy brow and thick hands, took you into his field, or what used to be a field. It was more mud than soil now, and the things growing from it barely resembled food. He knelt beside a patch of wilted barley, ran his fingers through the dry stalks, and sighed. He did not look at you when he spoke. "The grain has no strength," he said, "no sweetness. Even the pigs turn their noses from it now. But we harvest anyway. Something is better than nothing." That phrase would become a quiet refrain you would hear in every hut, in every field, at every fire. You tried to help. The work was backbreaking, not because of weight or pace, but because of the futility. Every ear of grain you collected seemed half dead, sun-starved, shrunken. You found yourself apologizing silently to the earth, as if your presence had somehow cursed it further. At mealtimes, if they could be called that, bowls of grayish porridge were passed around. Sometimes there were turnips, the occasional wild herb, or a few bits of foraged nuts. There was no salt, no meat, no joy. The people ate slowly, silently. Some closed their eyes. Others chewed methodically, as if reminding themselves that eating was still necessary. Hunger was no longer an occasional pang. It had become a constant companion, a dull and aching presence that never truly left. You noticed the gauntness in their faces, the hollows beneath eyes, the bones pressing against wool. Even the children seemed prematurely old. On the third twilight, though, whether it was truly the third day, you could not say you wandered to the village edge and met an old woman tending to a broken fence. Her name was Eleni. She carried a small copper amulet around her neck, though its image had long since worn away. She told you stories, her voice dry and cracked but unhurried. Once, she said, the world was alive with light, the sky was blue, the wheat stood tall, and laughter echoed across the hills. She had seen the blue sky with her own eyes. She paused. It was so blue you would not believe. She touched her amulet, but those days are gone now. You asked her when she thought the sun might return. She did not answer for a long while. When she did, she spoke gently. Perhaps not in our lifetime, perhaps never, but we keep on. That is all we can do. Time passed strangely. You learned to sleep in the dimness, to rise without sunlight. to mark days by the rhythm of chores and the sound of the church bell, which rang at set intervals regardless of the sky. The bell became your only clock. It told the people when to work, when to pray, and when to eat. It gave shape to the formless gloom. The church itself was one of the only stone structures in the village, modest but solid, its wooden cross casting long, shadowless silhouettes against the pale sky. Inside, you saw candles burning at all hours, flickering in rows, their soft light comforting against the world outside. There were no sermons, not as you would expect, no choirs, no hymn, only quiet gatherings, whispered prayers, and the scent of beeswax and mildew. A priest named Father Aurelius offered you bread Woncestale, but warm. He did not ask who you were. He only nodded and said, "Light lives in patience." It rained often, though the rain was different now. It fell in thin sheets, almost oily in texture, and left residue on the rooftops. The villagers collected it in barrels and clay jars. They said it was cleaner than the well, which had begun to taste bitter. You sipped the rainwater and tasted ash. As the endless twilight dragged on, strange things began to happen. In the stillness, your ears grew more sensitive. You heard whispers in the wind, or thought you did. Distant howls at night, though no wolves ever appeared. Shadows moved oddly at the corners of your vision. People began speaking of dreams, shared visions of fire and stone and a sky full of falling stars. Children cried in their sleep, whispering words they had never been taught. Eleni said the world was remembering something, something old, something buried. One night, or what passed for night, you stood alone at the edge of the river. Its surface reflected the dull gray sky like tarnished metal. You listened to the water, but it no longer gurgled or rushed. It moved slowly, sluggishly, as if uncertain of its direction. You saw a figure across the bank. A man or a woman, it was hard to tell. They were cloaked in black and stood still as stone. You raised a hand. They did not move. When you blinked, they were gone. You told no one. You learned quickly that stories like that were best left unspoken. People here clung tightly to what remained of their sense and reason. The veil between truth and madness had thinned. Then came the ashfalls, tiny, whispering flakes drifting down from the sky as if the clouds themselves were burning. They left a fine coating on your clothes, your hands, your food. People covered their mouths with cloth. Coughs became more common. The old and the weak faded faster. One evening, Gaius collapsed in the field. His lips were blue. He could not speak. They carried him to the church. He did not survive the week. No one cried. There were no tears left to shed. His wife wore his belt around her waist after he passed. It was a gesture of mourning. And yet, life continued. Babies were still born. Fires were still lit. Bread was still baked. The people refused to vanish. They moved forward not with hope, but with habit. The sky remained dim, but they refused to disappear into its shadows. You learned their ways. You cleaned tools. You fetched water. You watched the sheep, what few remained. You whispered prayers you did not believe. You held a child's hand when he was too weak to walk. You sat with a dying man and sang an old song you half remembered from your own time. He smiled, though he did not understand the words. You began to feel the weight of this world settle into your bones. The dimness outside had seeped inward, softening your thoughts, slowing your breath. You no longer longed for clocks or screens or electricity. You no longer expected the sun to return. You simply existed as they did, in the half-light, in the hush, in the quiet defiance of those who endured. There would be more to come. Storms, famine, fire. But for now, in this endless twilight, the world slept with its eyes open. And so did you. You open your eyes again, but it's impossible to tell if it's morning. The sky has not brightened. It remains that same leaden gray, as if the heavens are coated in soot. Your body aches with the stiffness of cold sleep. Beneath you is not the familiar mattress of your time, but a bundle of straw, uneven and matted, wrapped in wool that smells of damp lanolin and mold. You do not know how long you've slept, but your breath steams in the chill air of the one-room hut. Outside, the world has not changed. Still dim, still shadowed. You step out into the muted light, expecting dawn, but it's as if dusk has stalled, suspended above the earth in eternal pause. The sun is nowhere to be seen, not hidden by mere clouds, but filtered by something thicker, something ancient and unnatural. It glows faintly like a memory behind the veil of time. There are others in this world, survivors like you, but they walk slowly, eyes sunken, speech muted. Their hunger is hidden behind hard eyes and pursed lips. The crops have failed again. Wheat no longer grows tall and golden. It stunts, rots, or fails to break the surface at all. Trees no longer bear fruit. The earth is cold and dry, resisting the hands that once coaxed life from it. The people call it the long dusk. Some think it a punishment from the gods. Others blame a distant war, or whisper of stars falling from the sky. No one is certain. You try to ask, but the language is thick and old. Latin mixed with something else. The words dance just beyond your understanding. You spend time wandering from village to village, hoping for clarity or warmth or light. But all you find is sameness. All the fires burn dimmer now. Wood is scarce. Coal, scarcer still. And even the flames seem to fear the endless twilight. The smoke rises up and simply disappears into the murky air, blending into the ever-present haze that chokes the sky. A child stares at you with hollow eyes. His ribs show beneath his tunic. He clutches a wooden doll with one arm. The other is wrapped in a cloth soaked with old blood. No one looks twice. Illness is common. Infection is silent. There are no physicians here, only old women who mutter prayers and apply herbs that no longer grow properly. You wonder if the sun will return, if the warmth you once knew still exists somewhere beyond the edges of this frozen year. But even the animals act differently. Birds no longer sing. Crows, yes, but fewer now, as if even scavengers find less worth scavenging. The silence is thick, unbroken by insect or breeze. The air smells of dust and smoke, and your nose never stops stinging. One evening, though, it may be morning, you follow a procession of people climbing a hill. At the top stands a stone figure, eroded and faceless. They chant in a tongue you almost recognize. A desperate hope binds them together. You see an old man kneel before the stone and place an offering, a piece of bread no larger than your thumb. He closes his eyes. He waits. But the statue remains still. The people bow anyway. You sleep again. You dream of warm sunlight, yellow and brilliant. When you awaken, your fingers are stiff with cold. The dream seems cruel. You step outside, and the same gray sky greets you. The days and nights are blurring together. Time here feels like a spiral instead of a line. One man, toothless and bent, speaks of the fire mountain far away. He says it coughed ash into the sky and swallowed the sun. Another speaks of the sea turning dark and vomiting dead fish onto the shores. You hear fragments, a storm in the sky, a darkness moving like a wall, each story different, yet all circling the same truth. There are fewer children now. You notice that. Fewer cries, fewer games. They vanish, one by one, like the stars at night, no longer visible beneath the shadowed dome of the world. You wonder how much longer the people can endure, how long you can endure. You walk through a field that should be golden with grain, but is instead littered with brittle stalks. A boy stoops beside you, digging through the soil with a stick. He pulls up a shriveled root and bites into it. His teeth break the skin, but there is little nourishment inside. He eats anyway, chewing slowly. At night, you sit by a fire in silence with others. No one speaks unless it is to pray. The prayers are soft, fragmented, and come from many tongues. Greek, Latin, something older. Everyone is asking for the same thing: light, warmth, hope. You remember your own time: lights with switches, fire summoned with a button, food in abundance, water from a faucet. Here, everything is earned, and even then, never enough. The people here are not lazy, they are not foolish, they are simply trapped, like you, in a year that forgot how to end. You find yourself carving notches into a stick to mark the days. The stick is full now, yet the sky has not changed. No sun, no stars, just the same endless twilight. Someone begins to call this time the Year of Ash. You hear it whispered. The priests nod gravely. They have no answers. The altars hold no new light. Still, the people persist. Somehow, they plant again. They hope again. And though the children are fewer, a newborn's cry cuts through the night one evening. A soft sound, fragile but real. You close your eyes and let it echo in your memory. Perhaps there is something stronger than the sun, something more enduring than warmth. Something deep within these people that even the sky cannot erase. You wrap yourself in your cloak and sleep once more, still waiting for morning, still believing it might come. The cold has deepened. Though you can no longer see the sun, the world feels darker still. There is no snow, only frozen ground that no longer yields. The air is sharp, biting at your skin even through wool wrappings. Your breath curls into the stillness, pale wisps vanishing as soon as they appear. Each inhalation feels like pulling air through linen soaked in ash. This is winter now. Not the crisp white winter of storybooks or old memories, but the kind that comes without invitation or exit. The hunger winter. You awake from shallow sleep to the sound of wind pressing against thin walls. It howls not with ferocity but with a low, groaning weariness. The roof above you, thatch patched with hardened mud, creaks under the strain. Somewhere, frost has crept in, cracking the corners of the timber and leaving a lace of ice across the water jug beside your bedding. There is no breakfast, not in the way you remember it. No coffee, no eggs, no fire-toasted bread. The family you've joined in this small village has only broth this morning, and even that is generous. It's warm water steeped with old root vegetable sunion skins, bits of dried turnip, and a shard of bone boiled again and again until its marrow yields no more. You sip slowly, grateful. The warmth, however brief, spreads across your lips and teeth. The taste is faint, mostly of earth and salt. Yet for a few moments, it soothes the gnawing ache in your stomach. The children do not speak. They no longer ask for more. They sit in silence, eyes too large for their thin faces. A girl with flaxen hair clutches a cloth doll whose stuffing has begun to leak. Her hand trembles. Whether from cold or hunger, you cannot tell. Outside, the villagers gather in the center. Their shapes are cloaked in layers of fur, cloth, and wool, all patched, all faded. No one wears color. There is no room for beauty now. The market has long since vanished, replaced by occasional bartering when someone has something left to trade. Today, it is an old man offering a single chicken egg, a precious thing, a miracle even. He stands silently as people approach. They offer small bundles and exchange a handful of dried berries, a twist of twine, a carved button. He says nothing, just looks at their offerings and shakes his head. The egg remains cradled in a straw-filled pouch, like a relic. You speak to a woman whose face is lined with 1,000 quiet griefs. Her name is Lysandra. She once had 4 children. Now she has 1. The others, she says softly, were taken by the cold. Not with tears, not with anger, just a steady, empty tone, the same tone everyone uses now when speaking of loss. At night, people share stories not to entertain, but to remember who they are. A man named Ciro tells of a time when summers were green and full of bees. He closes his eyes and speaks of honeycomb and figs, of the feeling of sunlight warming his shoulders. The room listens, eyes half shut, as if the memory itself might feed them. No one knows why the winter is so long. The sky remains clouded, perpetually choked. The stars do not return. The moon, when visible, hangs weak and orange, like a dying ember. People guess. Some say a mountain exploded across the sea. Others whisper of dragons awakening from deep within the earth. A few speak of judgmental world punished for pride, and now left to hunger. You help carry buckets of water from the stream. The ice on its edges thickens each day. The current moves slowly, reluctantly. Your hands go numb with each trip, but you keep going. Everyone must work. Even children fetch, carry, chop, or boil. There are no idle hands now. One evening, the village hosts a communal meal. Not a feast such a thing hasn't been seen in years, but a shared pot, simmered over a low fire for most of the day. It smells faintly of barley and garlic. You see herbs floating in it, dried and sparse. The pot is small, and everyone gets only a few sips. But they gather anyway, sharing heat and silence. After the meal, songs are sung, not joyous ones, but songs of longing, a slow melody in an old tongue. The lyrics speak of a golden sun and a return to the sea, of a warm wind from the south that will melt the frost and awaken the fields. You do not know the words, but the feeling is universal. Even those too tired to sing hum along. The hunger changes you, not just your body, though you feel that to your limbs growing leaner, your energy waning, but something else. Your priorities rearrange, your thoughts slow. You no longer wonder what time it is or how many days have passed. Instead, you think, can I find firewood? Is there any root left in the storage pit? Is the stream still flowing? Lysandra teaches you to grind bark into powder. Mixed with hot water and a bit of lard, it can trick the stomach into feeling fed. Others dry moss, scrape it fine, and add it to flour. It makes the bread bitter and hard, but it lasts longer. Some speak of eating clay, of boiling leather, of trading anything than memories for something to chew. A man sells a carved necklace once worn by his mother for half a loaf of oat bread. No one blames him. You dream often now, not of home, not anymore, but of warmth, of wheat swaying under bright skies, of laughter. When you wake, your ribs ache from the cold. Your fingertips are cracked, and your lips split when you smile. But sometimes a smile still comes. A child's laugh, a dog barking in the distance, the soft crunch of frost underfoot. These things still exist, somehow. Life, even in famine, finds ways to breathe. In late winter, a traveler arrives. His boots are worn through, and his beard is thick with ice. He brings stories from other villages. He says the sun was glimpsed once, for a heartbeat, near the coast. Just a glow, just a pale disk. But it was there. people cried when they saw it. No one knows if it was real or imagined, but it gives the villagers something they haven't had in a long time. A rumor of hope. You tuck yourself beneath your blanket of woven goat wool. You close your eyes. The wind moans through the wooden slats. Your stomach is empty, but your heart is not. Somehow you've endured. Somehow they all have. Another day will come. Another twilight morning. Another bowl of broth. Another song. Perhaps even another smile. And so the hunger winter stretches on. But so does life. It had been days or weeks or perhaps months, it was difficult to tell. Time had softened around the edges, like parchment left too long in a fog. The sky had not changed. A dim gray hovered overhead, consistent and unwavering. No sunrise, no sunset. Only that same leaden haze, like an old woolen blanket thrown over the heavens. The villagers no longer spoke of the sun as a certainty. Now they whispered of it like a memory, something recalled from childhood stories, or a thing glimpsed in dreams that faded with the morning chill. In your small hut, which was damp no matter how many times you tried to patch the roof, the days stretched like thin broth over a bowl far too wide. Even the cockerel had stopped crowing. Why bother? When you emerged from the dwelling, wrapped in layers of rough wool and coarse linen, the world outside looked pale and soundless. The trees had not budded in spring, and the summer harvest had failed entirely. Now, what should have been autumn was indistinguishable from any other time-brown fields, cold wind and skies too heavy to speak of anything hopeful. The elders in the village muttered strange things. The seasons were gone, they said. Not delayed, not confused. Gone. The earth had fallen out of rhythm, and no one knew how to set it right again. The druids had no more answers. The priests had only more prayers. A boy from the edge of the village came into the square one afternoon, dragging a charred branch behind him. He said the sea had frozen. Not all of it, but the shallow parts near the coast. You overheard a merchant from a nearby town confirm the tale. Fish no longer came near the shore. The tide came in slower. The old rhythms were off, broken, as if nature had simply lost interest in its own clockwork. You began noticing how the livestock had grown thin and dull-eyed. They no longer bred, or if they did, the offspring were weak and trembling things. The cows gave milk that tasted of ash. The chickens laid eggs so rarely that when one was found, the entire village came to look at it, as though it were a jewel dug from the earth. And then there was the soil. You had always assumed that soil was eternal brown and black, thick with life, moist with promise. Now it crumbled in your hand like old bread. It was dry and pale, dusted with gray. Even the worms had disappeared, their burrows empty and collapsing. When you tried to dig, your wooden spade struck nothing but a silent rock. No one knew what to plant anymore. Barley wilted, rye never sprouted. Root vegetables shriveled underground before reaching maturity. The beets were white. The carrots, stunted and bitter, snapped like twigs when pulled too early. The herbs once used for healing were gone, not picked clean gone. The meadows where they had grown looked the same, but they were lifeless. The earth no longer offered her quiet gifts. The village meetings became longer and quieter. Plans were made with few words. Would we dig new trenches, rotate fields, pray more fervently? The answers were always the same. Try, wait, hope. A traveler came from the south. His skin darkened from birth rather than sun. He had walked for weeks. He said the same thing was happening in every village, every hill, every shore. No crops, no warmth, no sound from the skies. He told a story of a city so starved they ate the dogs and then the bark from the trees. You didn't want to believe him, but his eyes held a stillness you recognized. The kind that only comes from hunger and long silence. As winter approached again, or perhaps it was just the next phase of the endless cold, you began to forget what flowers looked like. Not just their appearance, but their purpose, their smell, their role in the rhythm of life. Children were born who had never seen color in the sky, who had never run through a green field, who had never picked a berry from a bush. You tried to remember a song your mother used to hum while kneading bread. It came to you slowly, and you sang it under your breath one gray morning while walking to the stream, hoping the ice wasn't too thick. The sound startled a nearby dog who had been quietly licking the frost from a stone. Even the animals had forgotten music. One night, you dreamt of a golden field. The sun was warm on your back, and bees floated lazily from bloom to bloom. You held a basket filled with pears. You smelled grass, heard wind through trees. And when you woke, you cried. Not loudly, just a steady trickle of tears that ran down your temples and into your pillow made of straw and silence. The world had not ended. It had simply stopped behaving. Like a guest who once brought joy but now sat in the corner refusing to speak. Still, you rose again that day, as always. You folded your rough blanket. You stepped into your worn shoes. You drank the last of the bitter broth. You looked at the sky. It had not changed. And yet, you kept going. Because that's what people did in 536. They endured. They waited. They whispered stories about the sun, and they hoped it would one day return. When you woke that morning, if it could be called morning, for the sky was just as dim as ever, the village felt quieter than usual. Not in the peaceful, comforting way that sometimes came after snowfall or rain, but in that eerie, hollow way a home feels when something vital has gone missing. The air had grown colder overnight. The chill bit at your fingertips even before you pushed back the rough woolen blanket. There was no bird song, no rooster's call, no distant hum of activity, just the sound of a hollow wind threading its way through half-collapsed fences and leaning trees. You stepped out, slowly, pulling your wool tunic closer. The same gray sky greeted you, unchanged as it had been for weeks and months. The fog no longer lifted. The mountains on the horizon had vanished days ago. The forest nearby no longer rustled with creatures. It was as if the world had exhaled once seen, then refused to breathe again. What news there was, when it came, arrived on foot and on cold, cracking roads. The empires, people whispered, were crumbling. You overheard the tanners discussing it at the edge of the village. One said the Eastern Roman emperor had fallen ill. Another insisted that the great city of Constantinople was suffering from a plague so terrible that its citizens burned their own homes to keep the sick out. A merchant passing through offered darker stories of cities locked down, of caravans ransacked not by bandits but by starving mobs, of governors gone silent, of tax collectors who never returned. The silence of distant capitals was beginning to creep into the countryside. Letters stopped arriving. Coins bore unfamiliar faces or none at all. The roads, once carefully maintained, grew wild at the edges. And still, the sun did not rise. Trade halted. Once you had seen fabrics dyed a brilliant violet from the east, metal pins shaped like birds, salt so fine it shimmered like powdered glass. Now all you knew was rough flax and bitter root vegetables. The baker's boy was seen scraping lichen from the north-facing side of a stone wall. You did not ask why. There were no armies to be seen, no parades of flags, no clatter of hooves. Even the rumor of empire had grown thin. It was as if the great cities across the mountains and seas had sunk quietly into the ground, swallowed not by enemy swords but by the long, hungry breath of the cold. One night by the fire, The old weaver told a story. She said that when the skies had darkened and the world began to turn cold, the gods withdrew from the affairs of men, not out of anger, but sadness. They could not bear to watch the quiet unraveling of everything they had once blessed. Her voice was calm, the way water flows under ice. No one interrupted, no one argued. You remembered hearing once of a scholar from Alexandria. Long ago, they said, he had claimed the earth was a perfect sphere, spinning in harmony with the heavens. But now, when you looked at the sky and saw no stars, you wondered if the heavens had stopped caring, or worse, if they had gone dark themselves. Days passed. Weeks, perhaps. Another traveler arrived, a gaunt man with frostbitten fingers and eyes that did not blink often. He had walked from the western reaches of Gaul, once a land of rich fields and marble towns. Now, he said, the fields lay bare. The granaries had collapsed. The roads were overrun by silence. Not armies, not wolves, just silence. He spoke of the Franks growing restless, of Roman officials abandoning their posts, of small villages seceding from the broader order of empire. Each place now made its own laws, printed its own coins, sharpened its own spears. The idea of empire, once so vast and enduring, had become too large for the cold. Your own village, though never part of the grandeur of Rome or Constantinople, had once been tied to the world by trade and tribute. Now, you were an island of fading warmth in a sea of slow decay. No more messengers came. No one asked for taxes. No census was taken. It would be easy to think that the fall of empires was sudden fire, blood, conquest. But what you saw now was different. The collapse was slow and quiet, like snow piling on a roof beam until the beam cracked. Not with a shout, but a sigh. One evening, the village council decided not to send representatives to the regional meeting. There was no one left to meet with, they said. The region was gone. You sat beside the fire that night, listening to the crackle of birchwood. There were no stories of kings or battles anymore. Only the mundane litany of survival: how to smoke fish without salt, how to dig wells when the ground was always half frozen, how to tell a fever from starvation. The elders no longer recalled the names of emperors. The children didn't know what an empire was, and you sitting cross-legged beside the hearth, feeling the cold creep into your boots, you found yourself no longer thinking of great cities or marble halls or distant banners. You thought of how the bread had tasted last week when there was still honey. You remembered the hum of bees. You remembered sunlight filtered through apple blossoms. You remembered warmth. And though you knew it might never return, you still looked to the horizon every so often, just in case something moved. Just in case the world remembered itself. The first signs were quiet, like everything in these dim days. A dry cough in the old that lingered longer than usual. A thinness in the cheeks of the young, even those who had managed to eat. You noticed a rash on the blacksmith's neck, a cluster of darkened spots like bruises in the shape of dying stars. He said it was nothing, but then so did the others. The rumors came with the wind, or perhaps from travelers trudging eastward. People no longer journeyed for trade or pilgrimage, only for escape. They spoke in hushed voices of a sickness spreading from the coast. Not the hunger you all knew, nor the winter fevers that came with damp straw and cold floors. This was something deeper, something darker. The air, they said, carried it. Or perhaps the rats. Or perhaps the rain. You watched the fields grow stiller. No more playful chasing of goats. No more gossiping over laundry by the frozen creek. People moved less, and when they did, they looked over their shoulders. Even the sound of someone coughing in the distance would quiet a room. The firewood crackled, but conversation didn't resume. It began in your own village with the healer's boy, a healthy, one lively, helpful, clever with his hands. One morning he didn't rise, the next his face was hot and his body cold. By the third morning he could no longer speak. His eyes were open, but he was somewhere far away. They buried him under the stone tree behind the chapel. No one said a prayer. The healer herself fell next. You remember the way she looked at you that final evening, not with fear, but resignation, as if she had seen this before and knew it would not stop with her. Then the woodcutter, then the baker's eldest daughter, then the man who kept the mill, whose hands were always coated in flour, now streaked with dried blood from coughing. The sickness had no pattern, no mercy. Rich or poor, old or young, it came like the dim sky, sudden, gray, inevitable. You began to notice the rituals changing. People no longer wept at burials. There were too many. Bodies were wrapped quickly, shallow graves dug where the ground wasn't frozen too deep. The priest said the rites more quickly, voice thin from exhaustion. Then he too began to cough. A man from a distant settlement told you it had spread through the empire. Not just the villages, not just the wild edges of the world, but into the cities Rome, Constantinople, Antioch. He spoke of death carts in the streets, of dogs eating the flesh of their masters, of priests standing at doorways whispering prayers to no one. You asked where he had come from. He simply looked to the road behind him and didn't answer. The days grew colder. Someone tried to burn the healer's cottage, fearing her herbs had cursed the village. Others prayed louder. Some grew silent entirely. You kept to yourself more, as most people did. The human voice had become rare, sacred, a sound more foreign now than the howl of wind or rustle of skeletal trees. When you did speak, it was in murmurs, and when you listened, it was with dread. There was talk once of a cure. A wandering monk from the south said he had heard of a village where no one had died, where the people drank hot milk with honey and slept with garlic tied to their wrists. But when asked where the village was, he stammered and changed the subject. You wanted to believe him. For just a moment you did. The snow came early that year, fine powder at first, then thick wet drifts that buried the roads and sealed shut the doors. You piled wood higher beside your hearth. You counted dried roots in jars. You watched the candlelight flicker against your walls and thought about the first time you had seen snow as a child, how magical it had seemed then. Now it was another weight pressing down on the world. They began to call it the plague of shadows. A name passed from breath to breath. It had no cause, no source, no shape. It was not like the god's wrath which came with thunder and flood. This was slower and somehow more cruel. It took not by fury, but by quiet erosion. One day, you realized you no longer heard the laughter of children, not anywhere in the village. The world outside the village was dying too, they said. Great libraries left to rot, cathedrals with doors hanging open, ships in harbors with no crews, sails flapping in dead winds, no more scrolls, no more sermons, only silence, cold, and time. At night, you lay beneath your blanket and listened to the wind move across the eaves. You didn't dream anymore, not really. Just soft flashes of light, of warmth, of color, like memories struggling to survive in a mind that had grown too tired to hold them. You wondered if this plague came not from the earth, nor from the air, but from sorrow itself. A sickness born not of germs or miasmas, but of grief too heavy to carry. And still you breathed. You woke, you gathered wood, you boiled what roots you had left, because there was nothing else to do, because the fire still burned, because the world, however dim and cold, had not yet ended. Not yet. It was sometime in the late gray of the second winter of seasons could even be counted anymore when you came upon a bundle of parchment, not neatly rolled, nor stored in a chest, but scattered beneath the floorboards of an abandoned home near the edge of the village. The house itself had sagged under the weight of time, its walls warping inward like it was trying to fold into itself, as if ashamed to still be standing. The wind had pried open the shutters, letting in dust and snow in equal measure. The hearth had long gone cold. But there, hidden where warmth had once pooled near the fireplace, you found the pages. They weren't grand scrolls from the hands of emperors. They were letters, some long, some barely a few lines, all inked in shaky hands, some bled with rain or tears. A few were so brittle they cracked when you touched them. You sat there on the floor, legs folded like a child at a lesson, and read them one by one. One was from a man to his brother in the East. I have not seen the sun in a year, Lucius. I wake each day not knowing if I am dreaming or truly awake. The goats are gone. Marcia has taken to singing in the evenings, though she forgets the words. I pretend not to notice. Another from a mother to a daughter she hoped had reached Antioch. Do you remember the fig tree, Amelia? I planted it when you were small. This spring it did not bloom. The leaves curled like old paper. I touched the bark and it crumbled in my hand. I miss your voice. A scribe's notes from Constantinople written in haste. The Latin neat but hurried. The sea is quiet, too quiet. No sails on the horizon for days. The harbor smells of rot and oil. I've closed the gates to the library. The ivy grows wild across the stone lions. I think they weep. You couldn't read them all in one sitting. It was too much. Not just the sorrow and the words, but the way they made you feel connected. You had grown used to silence, to believing you were among the last few left to feel anything at all. But here were the echoes of others, scattered across parchment like faint starlight. They had lived. They had remembered. They had written, knowing perhaps no one would read them. Yet they wrote anyway. In the days that followed, you returned to that broken house again and again. You read by firelight when you could spare the wood. You copied a few lines in charcoal on your own walls, verses that struck you, that stayed with you long after the flame went out. You started writing too. Not letters meant to be sent. There was no one to deliver them, no one to receive them. But you wrote anyway. You used old scraps of cloth, bits of bark, even the smooth undersides of broken roof tiles. You wrote to no one, or maybe to everyone. Today I saw a crow walking across the frozen stream. It stopped, tilted its head at me. I nodded. It nodded back. I think that counts as conversation. I had a dream last night. There were oranges, bright, warm, heavy in my hands. When I woke, I could still smell the sweetness. I heard someone singing. Not close, not clear. A voice carried through the trees like smoke. I didn't recognize the tune. I didn't want to. It was beautiful. You began leaving your writings behind, tucked into cracks in stone, folded into the hollow of tree trunks, pressed beneath piles of rocks at crossroads. You weren't the only one, you discovered. Others had done the same. A small piece of pottery scrawled with a single word. Remember. A scrap of linen embroidered with a child's name. A flat slate with the etched words. We were here. These weren't messages of despair. Not really. They were testaments. Little torches lit in the dark. A reminder that humanity hadn't disappeared, it had simply grown quieter, more careful, more reflective. Sometimes you imagine future hands finding these pieces. Centuries from now, when the sun had returned and the world bloomed again, would they understand? Would they hear your voice? Would they know that you endured not because you were brave or strong, but because you simply kept going. The nights grew colder, but also strangely gentler. You found comfort in the rhythm of ink, the slow scratching of quill or charcoal. You began keeping a record of days not by date, for calendars had ceased to matter but by moments. The deer returned to the field today. The snow melted for one afternoon. Someone lit a fire across the hilltop. I saw the smoke. I waved. The act of writing became your way of holding the world steady. Even as the stars above remained hidden, even as frost crept back beneath your door, and slowly a strange peace settled over you, the kind that comes not from certainty, but from acceptance, from knowing that even in the darkest years, humanity still had a voice. It had not been silenced, only softened. One night, you wrote a single sentence and tucked it beneath your pillow. Let the future know we dreamed of warmth. And you slept soundly that night, for the first time in many months. You did not set out to find the forest. It found you. One morning, if the dull smudge on the horizon could still be called morning, you noticed the wind had changed. Not in direction, there was little wind left at all these days, but in scent. It carried the faintest trace of wood smoke and something else, a kind of dampness that spoke of trees, of rot, of silence. So you followed it, past the village's edge, beyond the last stone boundary marker, and through a stretch of grass that had long since yellowed into brittle threads. You walked without speaking, without marking time, your footsteps soft in the quiet frost, and then, all at once, the world changed. The trees had been there all along, just hidden, crouched in the gray. They rose like forgotten guardians, tall and thin and stripped bare of color, bark no longer brown but pale as bone. Branches reached out in spindled arms, not to embrace but to remember, to ache. There were no leaves there, hadn't been leaves in years, but the ground was blanketed with something else. Fine, dark ash. It coated everything. Your boots, your sleeves, your hair. These were the ashen forests. No one had named them, but you did, silently. The name fit. It sat on your tongue like dust. Each step stirred tiny clouds into the still air. The ash didn't float like snow. It hovered, reluctant to rise, as if afraid of being noticed. The deeper you walked into the forest, the more the outside world disappeared. The sky above, such as it was, became a thick ceiling of gray. You could no longer tell where the sun might be, or even if it still moved. There were no birds, no rustle of animal paws, just the sound of your own breathing and the occasional creak of an old trunk shifting in the cold. You remembered once, long ago, walking in forests that sang with life woodpeckers tapping, squirrels chattering, the rustle of leaves dancing overhead. This was not that forest. This was a graveyard, a place where trees stood like statues, each one mourning something you couldn't name. You came upon a tree that had been hollowed by fire, its interior charred black, its top snapped clean off, like a candle burned too long. Yet it stood, alone, unmoving. You placed your hand upon it and felt warmth. Not the warmth of fire or life, but of memory. The wood hummed faintly under your fingertips, as if it remembered sunlight, as if the tree had not yet forgotten what it was meant to be. You whispered to it, "Do you still dream of spring?" There was no answer, but you chose to believe it did. You pressed deeper into the forest, found signs that others had come here too. Strange things, bits of rope tied in patterns between branches, circles of stones, a small wooden figure nailed to a tree, its carved eyes rubbed smooth by many hands. Perhaps rituals, or markers, or just attempts to bring meaning to a world that no longer made sense. At the heart of the forest, you found a clearing. It was round and perfectly quiet. No trees dared to grow in its center. Only a ring of tall black trunks circled its edge like watching sentinels. And in the middle stone, a monolith. You approached it slowly, reverently. It was ancient, older than the darkened sky. Its surface covered in glyphs, symbols you could not read. You traced them with your fingers, hoping for something understanding, comfort, a spark of recognition. But it was all forgotten language, all echoes. You sat beside the stone and closed your eyes. And there, in that circle of stillness, you heard something unexpected, a whisper. It was not loud, nor was it clear, but it was unmistakably a voice. Not yours, not from within. It came from the forest. It spoke no words, only sound soft, sorrowful, like wind passing through hollow bone. And you realized the forest had not stopped whispering. It whispered in the creak of limbs, in the fall of ash, in the way the trees leaned toward one another like mourners in shared silence. It had simply grown quiet, like the world, like you. You stayed there for some time, hours, perhaps days. The stillness wrapped around you not like a prison, but like a cocoon, a place to feel the weight of everything and the comfort of nothing. Before you left, you placed your own offering on the monolith, a single feather you had kept in your satchel from a crow long dead. You laid it down gently, as if it were a prayer. And then you walked back. The trees watched you go. You did not speak. You did not look back. But something inside you had changed. Not healed, not awakened, but remembered. And that was enough. The road that led out of the village had once been lively, with merchants and messengers, hooves and laughter, the occasional cart full of hay or salted meat, creaking and bouncing down the ruts. In better years, it was the lifeblood of the land, the thread that stitched together farms, hamlets, and stone cities over hills and across rivers. But now, it stretched like a wound. You stood at its edge where cracked flagstones disappeared beneath frostbitten dirt. There were no fresh wagon tracks, no muddy footprints, no wheel ruts cut deep by overloaded carts. Only the impressions of something older goes prints in the earth, smoothed over by ash and time. They called them famine roads now, because anyone who walked them carried the same hunger, the same silence. You stepped onto it with caution, not because you feared bandits that were long gone or long dead, but because every footfall seemed to echo, to linger longer than it should. Even the air was quieter here. It felt padded, as if the world were wrapped in wool. The road led you past the fields, once golden with barley, now choked with wild nettles, past empty wells, their ropes frayed, their buckets overturned, past crumbled stone walls that once marked land ownership, now marking only decay. You passed no travelers, only things they'd left behind. A shoe, its sole torn and toe curled like a blackened leaf. A wooden spoon, wedged upright in the frost like a signpost no one could read. A child's toy 2 sticks bound with thread that spun faintly in the wind. You didn't touch any of it. Somehow, it felt sacred, or cursed, or both. Farther on, you saw the old milestone. Once bright with carved distances, now eroded to nothing but a stump of stone. You remembered it from childhood. It marked the halfway point to the next village, the place where your father used to let you rest and drink from the leather skin he carried. You sat there now, as he once had. You sipped water gone warm in your pouch and let the cold kiss your skin. That's when you noticed the footprints. At first, you thought they were your own, looping back upon themselves. But Noth's tread was different. Bare feet, smaller than yours, deeper at the heel, the pace uneven. Someone had passed this way recently. You followed them without thinking, your senses sharpening, your mind half dreaming of a voice, a companion, a witness to your waking. The prince wandered off the road into a thicket of frost-blasted heather. There, at the edge of a grove, you found what remained of a campfire, dead for days. A few sticks blackened, half burned, arranged with care. A circle of stones, a linen scrap caught on a branch, but no one there. You sat beside the stones and warmed your hands over imaginary heat. You told yourself someone had survived here, even briefly, that perhaps you'd find them at the next bend in the road. That maybe, just maybe, you were not the only one still walking. The road resumed like a dream you couldn't wake from. You passed skeletal trees that held nothing but icicles, a barn without a roof, a single crow, dead and frozen, hanging upside down from a length of twine, a forgotten ward against hunger spirits, perhaps, or superstition from a time when the world still believed in cause and effect. You saw more footprints, then fewer, then none. At last, the road sloped upward into a hill you barely remembered. At the top stood a crumbling statue of a saint or a king. The face was worn smooth, one arm broken, but someone had tucked a dried flower into the crook of the remaining elbow. You placed a second beside Itone you'd carried from the ashen forest. A brittle bloom of unknown name, its petals paper-thin and black. Not a prayer, a gesture. As you descended the hill, the sky darkened again. The world became a bowl of soot and silence. The wind had teeth here. The frost bit harder. And still you walked, because the road remained. And so did you. You saw its outline before you heard it. In the old world, you would have heard it long before bells ringing from high towers, the ironclad tolls bouncing across the hills like jubilant thunder. Cities had once sung their presence, church bells for matins and vespers, for weddings and fires, for every hour of every day, a chorus of order, of life. But this city, the one before you, now was silent. You crested the last ridge before the valley and saw it. A huddled sprawl of stone and shadow nestled against the dark, sluggish river. Roofs collapsed like broken ribs. Chimneys poking from the mist like gravestones. And at its heart, the great cathedral, the tallest thing for 100 leagues now, barely taller than the fog. The bells were gone. Not missing, just absent. Their song had vanished long before the iron did. You remembered it, though you weren't sure if it was a memory or a dream. That pealing of bells on midsummer mornings. Weddings where the streets filled with garlands and fresh bread. Bells to mark coronations and deaths. Harvests and festivals. Snowfalls and miracles. Now the city marked nothing. Your feet crunched over gravel as you entered through what remained of the northern gate. A rusted hinge. A pile of broken spears. The guard tower was empty. Its top collapsed into a spiral of scorched beams and dead ivy. A weathered flag still clung to the pole, faded and stiff with frost. Inside the walls, silence pressed on all sides. You passed empty windows and shuttered doors. Shops with signs hanging at broken angles. A cobbler's, a baker's. A shop that once sold parchment and ink. The front glass of a jeweler's store still sparkled faintly beneath a layer of soot, though there were no jewels left behind. Everything was graystone. Ash, frost, bone. You turned a corner and found a street that had sunk into the riverbank. A row of houses tilted into the murky waters, their roofs jutting from the surface like sunken ships. Ducks once might have gathered here, children with sticks and paper boats, but now nothing stirred. The water was frozen, the air stilled. You passed a tavern. Its sign, "The Thirsty Lion," lay cracked beneath the snow. The door was ajar. Inside, the tables were overturned, chairs shattered, tankards covered in dust. You stepped around a spilled sack of grain, its contents gnawed long ago by rats or something worse. The hearth was cold, though faint soot remained in its throat. You lit a match and stared into the fireless black. You didn't stay long. Outside, you followed the wide stone road toward the cathedral. It rose from the city like a great mountain of sorrow, its spires cracked, its stained glass windows dimmed with centuries of soot and ruin. The front doors stood open, their heavy oak warped and weathered. You entered and found nothing. No congregation, no priests, no echo of choral voices. Only pews rotted with mold, and a floor lined with fallen plaster. The altar had collapsed. The great wheel of glass behind Ida Rowe's window, once painted with saints, and martyrs, was now a hole to the ashen sky. And the bells. You climbed the spiral stairs, hand over hand along the frozen rope, your breath clouding before you. The bell tower was higher than you remembered. Every step creaked with time. Finally, you emerged into the loft. There were no bells. Only the great wooden beams where they once hung, splintered and blackened by fire. Rusted chains swayed gently in the wind. One thick rope lay coiled on the floor, like the carcass of a serpent. You sat at the edge of the platform and looked down at the sleeping city. You wondered when the bells were taken before the famine or after. Were they melted for weapons, carted off by kings or bandits? Or had they simply cracked, one by one, under the strain of being the last thing singing in a world that no longer wished to hear? You closed your eyes and tried to remember the sound, but it was gone. Even memory has limits, you realized. Even echoes fade. You stayed there until nightfall, not because you feared the dark, but because it no longer mattered. When you climbed down, you passed a faded mural near the door. It showed the city in gold leaf, with banners flying, fields bursting in color, crowds gathered in joy. Children ran, horses pranced, bells rang. You touched the mural, dust came away on your fingers, and then you stepped back into the hollow streets. The city made no sound as you left it behind. The hills stretched for miles, but they carried no sound. The wind dragged itself slowly across the stone and grass, unable to whistle as it once did. It was as if the air itself had grown heavy, weighed down by the same grayness that hung over the sky and pressed into the soul of every living thing. You were no longer walking the wide road of history. You were meandering through its shadows, where even the familiar shapes of the land seemed uncertain. Once, these highlands had been dotted with movement, goats climbing the rocks with bouncing, sure-footed grace. Sheep gathered in soft clusters, dogs barking, chasing each other, alert to every strange scent in the wind, and the shepherds' young men mostly, and sometimes children standing with staffs in their hands and song in their throats, watching the flocks scatter, graze, and regroup like woolen clouds shifting with the terrain. But not now. Not in this world where the sun had vanished into ash and the seasons had forgotten how to be themselves. The stone beneath your sandals is slick with frost. It is the middle of the year, a time when wildflowers once gathered in bursts of yellow and violet across the meadows. Now, the only thing sprouting is a stubborn moss that clings to what little warmth the earth can muster. You keep walking. The ground is uneven, the silence unnerving. There are no shepherds here, only old posts where fences once stood, cracked and leaning like drunken teeth. Only traces of hoof prints that lead nowhere, faded in the mud like memories on the verge of being forgotten. In the valley below, you spot the ruins of a cottage. It is nothing grand, only a humble shell with one wall still standing, and part of a roof sagging under the weight of snow that should have melted months ago. Smoke no longer curls from the chimney. The wooden gate has been torn from its hinges, and the door flaps listlessly in the wind. You step inside and see the remnants of a life that once was. A hearth filled with cold gray ash, a single stool broken at the leg, an iron pot turned over, rust beginning to take hold. A sheepskin lies curled in the corner like a sleeping dog, but there is no shepherd here, not anymore. You sit for a moment on a pile of stone and listen. Sometimes in the silence you imagine hearing voices, echoes of a time before the year turned against its people. You imagine a boy humming to himself as he scraped lichen from the rocks to feed a goat too weak to forage. You picture a mother calling her children inside as clouds gathered above, before they had learned that clouds no longer meant anything. You think of someone lighting a fire here on a day like this, hands trembling not from cold, but from fear, and whispering prayers to gods that had gone silent. What were they hoping for? Not warmth, not food, perhaps just a sign. Any sign at all. Outside, the wind picks up again. It groans against the stone and tugs at the door, a sound like a sigh that never ends. You step out and pull your shawl tighter, the fabric rough against your skin. Each thread smells faintly of wood smoke and damp straw, as if trying to remind you of all the homes you've passed through since waking in this ruined year. The shepherd's path continues, winding along the edge of the hill like a thought that never quite settles. You follow it because there is nothing else to do. As you climb, your breath fogs the air. Your fingers have turned red from the cold, even beneath your gloves. At times you wonder if the cold is not just in the air but in your very blood, as if the darkness has settled into your bones. You think again of the shepherds who once lived here. Did they abandon their flocks willingly, or did the earth take them? Was it famine, fever, or simply the despair that spread like smoke through every village, every valley, every forgotten corner of the empire? You crest the hill and come upon a small shrine. It is half buried in snow and stone, the paint faded, the idols chipped. A carved ram with broken horns stares back at you, eyes worn smooth by time. Someone left an offering here long ago, a circle of grain, now crumbled to dust. You kneel beside it and rest your hand on the cold stone. You do not know the name of the god this place honors, but you whisper thanks anyway, not for anything in particular, just for the silence and the space to rest within it. Further on, you see the skeleton of an orchard, apple trees that no longer bloom, their branches stretched skyward like ribs. A crow watches you from one of the limbs, silent and still, too thin to caw. You pass beneath it, your shadow merging with the trees until both become indistinguishable in the pale light. You think of how time works differently now. Days pass like years. Hours stretch so long that they start to lose meaning. And dreams when they come here filled with faces you've never met, voices you don't understand, and landscapes that belong to no map you've ever seen. The sun never rises here. Not properly. The light remains the same dull smear, like wax spread across the slate sky. You measure time now by how tired you feel, and you are always tired. Not just in your body, but in your thoughts. Even hope itself seems to sleep. You reach the edge of a cliff where once a pasture overlooked the sea. Now the waves are dull and sluggish, moving beneath a sky that offers no reflection. The horizon disappears into fog. You sit again. The rocks beneath you are cold but solid, and that is enough. You run your fingers along the edge of a broken staff someone once used to guide their herd. The wood is soft with rot, but you hold it anyway, as if by gripping it you might hold on to some small part of the world that was. Below, the valley lies motionless. You see no movement, no animal life, no rising smoke. You think of the shepherd who once stood here, maybe on a morning just like this, eyes scanning the land for signs of straying sheep. You wonder if they ever came back, if they found anything at all, or if they simply stood here, as you do now, waiting for something to stir in the vast silence of a world that no longer has need for waiting. You lie back on the stone and close your eyes. The wind whispers around you. The clouds move slowly above, thick and permanent, like the lid of a sealed jar. The earth beneath you is old and tired, but it still holds you, and that perhaps is all you need. Tomorrow you will walk again. Tomorrow you will follow another path. But tonight you will rest here, in the highlands where shepherds once watched their flocks, and where now only the wind and the stone remain. You awaken to the soft crunch of dry soil beneath your feet. The mist has not lifted. It hangs low, stubborn, shrouding the hills and valleys in a pall of dim, colorless light. There is no blue in the sky, no golden sun, just the same gray dome stretched overhead with the smell of frost and smoke riding the wind. It is morning, or what passes for it in the year 536, and you are standing on a narrow path along the ridge of a mountain that overlooks the broken remnants of what was once a pasture. A shepherd's crook lies discarded by a lichen-covered rock, and there are no sheep to be seen. The earth is brittle here, cracked. The grass, where it still clings to the soil, is brown and stiff, rattling like paper in the wind. You notice the absence of birds, no chirping, no wing beats, only the low groan of wind through the broken trees and the distant cough of a village waking up somewhere down in the valley. You are alone on the path, save for the memory of a man who once came here each day to watch over his flock. He is not here now. Perhaps he abandoned the land when the sheep began to vanish, one by one, consumed not by wolves or men, but by hunger and disease. Perhaps he left the hills when the first frost clung to the fields in late spring and refused to melt. Or maybe he still walks this path each day, a ghost of his former self, clutching his empty crook and searching the hillside for animals that will never return. You imagine him this shepherd young once, with weathered hands and sun-creased eyes. He would have known the names of all his sheep. He would have sung to them, called them by whistles and soft clucks of the tongue. But then came the ash, the cold, the long dusk. The pasture turned sour. The lambs were born too weak to walk. The ewes grew thin. He did what he could, but it was not enough. There are stories like this scattered across the mountains of this age. Shepherds and farmers, hunters and fishers, all of them bound to rhythms that no longer worked, rituals that no longer bore fruit, their livelihoods undone by forces far beyond them. You can feel the weight of this sorrow as you move carefully down the trail, your breath forming pale clouds before your face. Below, in the valley, a village huddles close together like a clutch of sleeping animals. Roofs are low, thatched, covered in soot and frost. The houses are sunk slightly into the earth, half homes, half burrows meant to trap heat in a world that no longer warms. Smoke drifts lazily from chimneys, curling around the outlines of blackened pine trees. As you walk, you pass a pile of stones by the side of the trail. A cairn, a crude grave marker. The shepherd, perhaps? Or one of his flock? A child, even? You cannot tell. The stones are weathered smooth, as if the wind itself mourned the soul buried beneath them. In the village, life persists, but only just. A woman leans against a door frame, wrapped in a blanket made from coarse, homespun wool. Her eyes meet yours, hollow and sunken, before flicking away. You hear the soft clink of clay cups inside, the scrape of iron over a cooking pot. A child coughs, a dry, racking sound. No laughter, no music, only survival. The shepherd's absence is mirrored here. Livestock are rare. A single goat, tied to a fence post, chews aimlessly at bark. A chicken walks slowly across the muddy street, dragging one foot as if too tired to lift it. And still, the people rise each day, bundle themselves in whatever warmth they can find, and continue. That is all they can do. You are given a place by the hearth of one home, offered a bowl of thin soup made from root vegetables and dried herbs. The fire gives no real heat, only the illusion of it. The woman tending the pot wears layers of patched wool, her hands wrapped in rags. She does not speak, and neither do you. Words feel out of place here. This is a world of gestures and glances, of shared silence and the language of enduring. As you sip the soup, you hear the story of the shepherd again, not in words, but in the way the villagers look at the hills, the way they pause when the wind changes. He was one of them. Maybe he was loved. Maybe he was just known. But he is gone now, and they all carry that emptiness. Later, you follow an old man to the edge of the village where a stone wall crumbles around what used to be a pen. He points at the broken posts, the scattered tufts of wool caught on barbs. His face is like the bark of an old tree, cracked, lined, stubbornly rooted. He taps his chest once and then the horizon, as if to say, "We watch together." Then he shakes his head. Gone. There is a heaviness here that no one tries to explain. They live with it like they live with the cold. It's just there. It clings to every nail, every thatch of straw, every breath. There is no grief ceremony, no grand burial. Just the daily march of feet through gray soil and the slow turning of a wheel that no longer spins quite right. In the evening, when the sun should set, it merely fades. The sky darkens slightly, as if reluctant to admit the day ever happened. You are given a place to sleep in the hayloft of a barn with no animals. The straw is coarse and smells faintly of old dung and damp wood. You lie down fully clothed, wrapping yourself in your cloak. There is no warmth, only less cold. Above you, the rafters creak. The wind moans through a broken slat. You think again of the shepherd. Was he real, a man of flesh and breath, or just the shape of loss this land wears like a cloak? You are not sure, but you feel him as clearly as the cold. Sleep comes slowly, in waves. Your body aches. Your thoughts are sluggish. You drift into dreams of a bright sun, of laughing animals, of green grass bending under the weight of playful hooves. But these dreams fade, and you wake several times in the night to silence so deep it presses against your ears like cotton. When morning comes again, if it can be called morning, you rise with the others. You help carry water from the stream, icy and slow beneath a crust of frost. You share in a breakfast of dried bread and broth. You nod at the old man who nods back. Nothing is spoken, but something passes between you. You leave the village at midday, walking once more along the shepherd's trail. There is no one on the ridge. The crook is still there, the cairn still quiet. You stop and place a small stone on top, as you saw others do, a mark of respect, a gesture of presence. The world remains dim, but for a moment, standing on that cold hillside, you feel something like peace. Not comfort, not warmth, but the quiet resolve of those who remain when others have vanished. The stubborn heartbeat of survival in a time that offers nothing but cold winds and long silences. You continue on. The days had long begun to blend together now. Each morning, if one could even call it that, emerged not with a sunrise but with a faint lifting of darkness, like soot diluted in water. The world remained cloaked in a dim veil, and those living through it had ceased expecting change. The sky above continued to hang low and oppressive, and the very earth beneath their feet had begun to feel unfamiliar. The soil, once rich and full of life, had changed. It was colder, wetter, stiffer. It was no longer something to be trusted, and those who walked upon it could feel that something ancient had stirred beneath its surface, something vast and slow and quiet, something that didn't quite sleep. You wake with your back against the curved wall of a damp hut, its straw roof dripping with condensation, its floor coated in thin mud. Your body acts not from work, not from injury, but from the simple act of existing here. There is a fatigue that is set into your bones, not sharp, but all-consuming. It makes your limbs feel like they're no longer part of you. The ash that blew into your lungs weeks ago has never quite left. Each breath is shallow and rattling. You no longer notice the coughs. When you stand, the ground gives a little under your feet, sucking at your soles as if trying to hold you back. The dirt is no longer dry, cracked, or dusty. It is spongy and strange, like a wet sponge filled with rot. You step carefully. Everyone does now. The roads, if they can still be called that, have eroded into slush. Cart tracks filled with sludge. Footprints vanish within minutes. Nothing is permanent anymore. Even your trail back to the well disappears as quickly as you make it. You make your way to the communal path, where once there were neighbors and children and voices. Now there are shadows. People move more slowly. They no longer greet one another. There's no energy for that. They glance without lifting their heads. Their shoulders remain hunched. Everyone has shrunk. From hunger, yes, but also from caution. From cold. From a world that seems to be closing in on itself. Even the animals are quieter. The birds, those few that remain, no longer sing. They croak. They rasp. Their feathers are grayer now, covered in the same ever-falling ash that touches everything. Goats wander with vacant stares. Chickens no longer peck with urgency. Their heads droop. You haven't seen a fox in weeks. Not even scavengers are confident anymore. You pass a field once meant for barley. It lies wasted, furrowed with ruts from failed planting attempts. The earth here is black and heavy, and no matter how many times it is tilled, it yields nothing. The farmers gave up on it a few weeks ago. Now it just sits there, an empty canvas of despair. Someone built a scarecrow in the center, hoping to protect something that no longer grows. It leans forward unnaturally, its arms outstretched in a posture that seems more like surrender than defense. Its straw-stuffed chest is caved in. One eye droops lower than the other. It looks less like a guardian and more like a mourner. Not far from the field, there's an old tree. It once marked the edge of the village, tall and proud, its limbs stretching like arms into the blue. Now, its bark is cracked and its limbs are sagging. No leaves, no life. Just the occasional shuffle of a crow hopping along a branch, its beak searching for something it won't find. The tree is no longer a symbol. It's a shadow of what it was, and you wonder, as you always do, whether it will still be there tomorrow. You keep walking. There are stories now, murmurs, about the ash. They say the ground is changing. Beneath the topsoil, a thick layer of fine gray dust has formed, pressing up from beneath like a second skin. Dig deep enough and you hit it. Not rocks, not roots. Just ash, endless and dry and still warm to the touch. No one wants to talk about why that might be. It reminds the elders of stories they were told as children of fire gods buried deep below the crust, of ancient punishments from the heavens, No one mocks those stories anymore. It's too easy to believe them now. You return to your hut at midday, if one can still call it that. There is no sun to track, no shadow to chase. Time is told now by hunger. When the pangs become too great, it must be time to eat. You have a scrap of something root boiled until soft, its flavor long gone, its purpose now just to occupy your stomach. You eat it slowly, very slowly, letting the act of chewing carry you through the hour. Someone coughs nearby. Another cough joins it. A chorus of sickness, distant but familiar. Later, you go to the river. The water is lower than it should be, narrower. It gurgles as it flows, but the sound is shallow, uncertain. The riverbanks have eroded, as if the earth itself no longer wants to be near the water. The fish have vanished. No minnows dart, no frogs croak. There is only the slow, tired trickle. You dip your hands in, and the chill stabs at your bones. Your fingers ache, but you hold them there anyway. It's the only sensation left that isn't just dullness or hunger. Pain is something you can recognize, something real. You sit on the bank for a while. A fog begins to roll in. It comes quickly now, more often. It is thicker, 2-day heavier. You can see it gather over the trees like a lid being closed on the world. Visibility fades. The shapes of the huts dissolve. You hear someone call out a name. A child, maybe. A parent. The voice is swallowed by the gray. You do not move. You let the fog surround you, wrap around your shoulders like a damp blanket. You close your eyes, and you imagine light. The ash has become part of life. It collects in corners. It rests on rooftops. It weaves into fabric. It lines your lungs. At first, it was something people swept away, cleaned, battled. But now it is simply there, like wind, like cold. It has become a character in the village's daily rhythm. And beneath it, beneath everything, is the sense of something vast and unknowable, something that the earth has not revealed yet, but hints at constantly. There is no spring, no change of seasons, only the dimness, the quiet, the strange warmth beneath your feet when you walk the trails too long. And now, when you look at the ground, you notice something new. Tiny cracks in the mud, hairline fractures that stretch in straight lines. They weren't there before. They spread slowly, like veins, spidering toward the fields, the huts, the river. No one mentions them aloud, but everyone steps around them. The earth is whispering. You feel it. That night, as you try to sleep, the wind howls slightly differently. It rises in sharp bursts, like it's angry about something. The hut creaks. Your blanket does little to keep you warm. You think of the ash layer again, and of what might be beneath it, something ancient, something breathing. Sleep eventually comes not gently, but like a blanket drops suddenly over your thoughts. It is not restful. Your dreams are dark and strange, and when you wake, the cracks in the earth are a little wider. And so another day begins, not with sunlight, just with the absence of anything else. The path out of the village was barely more than a memory of road. Stones once set by Roman engineers had been swallowed by earth and moss, and trees leaned in as if eavesdropping on the steady trudging of the weary traveler. Your feet, shod in cracked leather and caked in the mud of a dozen settlements, moved forward with no destination in mind, but with the certainty that remaining still meant surrender. Each step you took was accompanied by the muffled crunch of undergrowth, the whispered creak of distant trees, and the soft hiss of wind weaving through an otherwise silent world. A small pouch at your side held the last remnants of dried barley cakes, stale and breaking apart with the lightest touch. In your hand, a crooked staff offered balance, not just for the uneven path, but for your weary mind. It had been weeks since you left the hamlet where sickness had taken most and silence had claimed the rest. The sky above remained the dull gray of ash and fog, never bright, never changing, a featureless ceiling that offered no hope of dawn or dusk. Time had become a circle. Day and night were ideas now, not realities. You passed the ruins of a way station once manned by imperial couriers. Its roof is gone, its walls bowed with damp. Ivy has claimed the stonework. An old iron lantern dangles from a splintered beam, swinging slightly in the wind as though greeting you with a ghost's courtesy. You pause, the weight of the moment pinning you in place. Here once passed messages, decrees, dreams sealed in wax. Now only echoes remain. You sit on a fallen log and unwrap your cloak, shaking out the droplets of mist that seem to settle anew every hour. The air is thick with moisture and the scent of mold. Somewhere in the forest, an animal calls a short, guttural sound, followed by silence. You eat slowly, chewing each piece of barley cake longer than necessary, more for something to do than for sustenance. Hunger is no longer a pang but a constant hum. Your body has grown used to this half-fed state. Your mind has dulled to match. Travel in these times means evasion, not of wild animals or spirits, though those still linger in the minds of many, but of other humans. Bands of desperate men, some wearing bits of armor, others in peasant rags, move through these lands seeking what little can be taken. They do not speak, they only look, and if they like what they see, they take. You had seen them once, in the lowlands near the river. They pass within 100 paces of you, unaware of your presence beneath the root-tangled bank. You did not breathe until the last boot print had vanished into the trees. You rise and begin again. The path narrows. The land has changed subtly. More pine, less oak. Stones here are older, covered in runes you cannot read, likely carved by hands long dead. You pass shrines half collapsed, their idols worn smooth by time and weather. One still holds a fragment of wax candle, its wick blackened, its flame long gone. You kneel instinctively. You no longer know to whom you pray, but it feels wrong not to. A sudden drizzle turns the mist to rain. It is never harsh, never strong, but always there, soaking into cloth and skin until everything clings and drips. You walk with your head down, water tracing along your cheeks and nose, pooling at your collar. Your thoughts wander, drifting back to the faces of those you've left behind. Your sister, who sang in the mornings even when the bread was gone. The old man in the village square who claimed the darkness was punishment. The boy who asked if the sky would ever be blue again. You don't remember what you answered. A low wall appears through the trees, part of a larger structure swallowed by ivy and neglect. A monastery, or what remains of it. The door hangs crooked on its hinges, but the stone offers shelter. Inside, the air is dry. Dust clings to every surface. The scent is of old wood and crumbling parchment. You set your pack down and explore with the reverence of a thief in a sacred tomb. Scrolls lie scattered across a table, their ink smeared by time. You do not know the language, but the shapes of the letters feel familiar, like the murmur of a song you once heard in a dream. You find a dry corner and rest. Outside, the rain continues, steady and patient. The wind makes the timbers creak above. You drift in and out of sleep, lulled by the monotony of the storm and the distant drip of water. In your dreams, the sky is blue. You are running through a field of yellow flowers, and someone is calling your name. When you wake, the sound is still in your ears, but no one is there. You remain for a day, maybe two. It is difficult to measure time. When hunger pulls at you with renewed urgency, you move on. Before leaving, you light one of the old candles with a flint. and say a few quiet words to no one. You do not look back. Further along the path, you find signs of life. Faint footprints in the mud, a woven basket half buried in leaves, a length of string tied to a branch, possibly a snare. You tread carefully, calling out in soft tones, offering peace, food, trade. Silence answers. Perhaps they are watching. Perhaps they are long gone. You leave a barley cake behind, wrapped in cloth on a stone, like an offering. One evening, the sky shifts. It is not brighter, but the gray seems thinner. You think you can almost see shapes in the clouds. It might be nothing. It might be hope. You allow yourself to feel it, briefly. Then you wrap your cloak tighter and keep walking. You pass a man sitting alone by a ruined well. His beard is long and tangled, his eyes distant. He does not speak, and you do not ask questions. You sit beside him. You share what little you have. He nods. At night, you both sleep beside the well, backs pressed to its cold stone. In the morning, he is gone, and you wonder if he was ever really there. The land begins to change. The hills soften. You see fields, not fertile, but cleared. You see smoke in the distance, a sign of life. Your heart quickens. You approach carefully, announcing yourself at the edge of the clearing. A woman steps from a low hut, her face wary but not unkind. She speaks a dialect you mostly understand. She offers you broth, thin but warm. She lets you sleep on the floor beside her children. The next day, she sends you on your way with a cloth-wrapped bundle and a nod. You do not belong anywhere now. You are a shadow among ruins, a breath in the fog, a pair of tired feet moving through a forgotten world. But the journey continues. Somewhere ahead, a village remains. A farm with 3 chickens, a man with stories, a girl with laughter. The world has not ended, not completely, and as long as you walk, as long as you breathe, you carry its embers with you. So you walk, step by aching step, into the mist, into the silence, into the long, quiet tomorrow. The road that led you further south had not been a road in the usual sense of the word. Rather, it was a string of goat trails and cart paths that twisted through forests of skeletal trees and across hills that had forgotten the warmth of sunlight. You had been walking for what felt like many days, though time had become as foggy as the sky. Each morning resembled the one before, a dim bloom of gray, and every night settled quickly into a deep charcoal silence. Hunger followed like a companion, but not so close that it pressed you down. It simply whispered at the edges, reminding you that nothing in this age was easy, not even the passing of a day. You came across a village nestled in a narrow valley, the homes dug halfway into the earth as if the land itself had tried to swallow them up. It was here that you found shelter with a man named Sebastos and his family, and here that your understanding of this broken world deepened once again. They had little to give, yet gave what they could without hesitation. Dried barley crusts, boiled nettles, and a stew made from the skin and bones of an animal long since consumed. You were grateful, and they asked nothing of you but patience, for even conversation came slowly in a land where grief had stretched across too many winters. Sebastos had once been a stonemason, his hands wide and calloused, each knuckle darkened by years of lifting and chiseling rock. But now the tools he owned lay silent in the shed beside the hut, their iron rusting in the wet air. He had no more commissions, for there were no more temples being raised, no fountains in need of carving. What remained were the stones themselves, unmoving, silent, witnesses to a world in retreat. You asked if he missed the work, and he only looked at you with a soft half-smile. the kind that knew better than to hope. His wife, Ileana, had taken to planting herbs in wooden troughs beside the house, though few grew properly. The mint came up yellow, the sage refused to spread, and the lavender had long since surrendered to the dust. Still, she tried. Every morning she knelt before them, whispering small blessings as if they might respond. The couple's two children, Petros and Myra, played with carved wooden animals that their father had once made for another child who never came to collect them. The children's laughter, though faint, lingered in the valley like a ghost from a better time. On your third evening with them, Sebastos took you to the ridge that overlooked the valley and told you about the city that once stood beyond the horizon. He spoke of Antioch, once a place of marble columns and endless markets, where silks from the east hung alongside amphorae of olive oil from the west. But he had heard stories that it had been swallowed by fire and flood, its beauty lost beneath layers of ash and grief. He told you of refugees who came through these hills, their eyes too dry for tears, their mouths silent from days without speech. Some stayed. Some continued westward in search of a salvation that no longer existed. He hadn't seen a traveler in weeks, maybe longer. In the quiet that followed, the wind passed over the ridge like a sigh, cool and constant. Sebastos spoke again, this time of something more ancient, of stories handed down from before even his grandfather's time. He told you that the earth had always gone through cycles of cold and warmth, of life and retreat. He told you of a river that had once changed its course overnight, and a mountain that had spewed fire until the sun itself was hidden. It was said that the gods fought among themselves, and the sky bore the scars. But he said it all with the calmness of a man who had accepted the shape of things, who had seen the stars vanish, and no longer questioned why. You spent many days with them, helping where you could, gathering fallen wood, scaring away the crows, turning the soil in search of buried roots. The rhythms of this quiet place began to settle into you. The days passed not with clocks or candles, but with the sound of roosters and the length of shadows. You began to understand that survival here was not about defiance or strength, but about softness, a kind of surrender to the quiet work of staying alive. And yet, the world was still breaking, far beyond what you could see. On one morning, Sebastos returned from a nearby hamlet with news. A fever had taken hold in one of the lower valleys. Children and old men first, then mothers. He said it was the breath of bad air, stirred up by the endless damp, or perhaps a punishment sent from above. He was not sure. He only knew that if it reached them, there would be nothing to do but bury the dead and wait. That evening, he burned dried rosemary on the hearth and whispered a prayer you did not understand. There were stories, too, of strange lights in the sky. A shepherd who had seen twin suns at dawn, though the second one flickered and then vanished. A fisherman who claimed the sea had turned black for a day and swallowed every fish from his net. You did not know whether to believe them, but neither did anyone else. The world had become too broken to separate miracle from madness. And so the stories were folded into the everyday, treated like weather or dreams, acknowledged and then set aside. On the seventh day, Ileana placed a shawl over your shoulders and told you gently that it was time to go, not because they no longer wished your company, but because she had seen something in your eyes, the same restlessness that had driven the sun underground and stirred the winds from the mountains. She said that some people were meant to walk, to witness, that you might carry stories for those who could no longer speak. And so, with bread in your satchel and her blessing on your brow, you left the valley behind. You walked once more into the gray, the trees, the stones, the slow wind at your back. You did not know where the road would lead, only that it would, somewhere beyond the mist and the silence, somewhere where others had not yet forgotten how to hope. And as you walked, you thought of Sebastos and Ileana and the children playing with wooden horses. You thought of mint that refused to grow and prayers spoken to a sky that refused to answer. You thought of the quiet dignity of survival. And perhaps that was what remained in this world. Not greatness, not glory, not the return of golden cities or the warmth of sunlit temples, but small, persistent acts of endurance, the planting of seeds that might never bloom, the sharing of bread with a stranger, the telling of stories beneath a sky that had forgotten how to burn. It was not enough to save the world. But perhaps, just perhaps, it was enough to save the soul. The air was never truly still anymore. Not since that day. Not since the sky turned to tarnish and the sun began its long retreat behind the veil. Now, even the quietest days came with a hush that pressed in from all sides. The silence broken only by the faraway rustling of the wind over dry grasses that should have long since been green. It was a ghost wind now, one that crept along the steppes with the patience of centuries, gliding low over barren fields and past the half-buried remnants of broken wheels and bones long bleached. You awoke with it in your ears always, with it rising from a bed made of fur and straw, tucked into the belly of a yurt, the world outside a sphere of dust and chill. You blinked and rubbed your face, the smell of ash embedded deep in the woolen walls of your shelter. Your hands were numb, your nose stung, and your lips cracked as they parted with the first breath of the morning. Even inside the tent, there was a thin haze of smoke or frost. You couldn't tell anymore. Maybe both. The stove had gone out in the night, and the embers inside the iron belly of it lay still and gray, no longer warm enough to fend off the creeping cold that came in through the seams. The firewood had run low weeks ago, and even the dried dung you'd relied on for heat had grown scarce. You pulled on your Kothor's hide and patched felt, stiff in places where the smoke had soaked in and never left, and you stepped outside. The world was brown, not the warm brown of summer's pastures, nor the gold of dry autumn stalks, but a sickly, damp brown that sucked the light from everything it touched. The grasses underfoot were thin, brittle, and sparse. In every direction, the flat expanse of the steppe stretched to the edge of vision, wrapped in low clouds and veils of drifting soot. A neighbor's dog barked far away, muffled by distance and the ever-present fog. Your mare, bones more visible than they ought to be, stood tethered nearby, her breath a slow plume in the air. She eyed you with tired recognition. You ran a gloved hand along her neck and muttered a soft apology. She hadn't had proper feed in days. None of the animals had. You weren't sure how long they'd last. The villager what passed for one was a scatter of yurts and canvas-covered wagons, a few rough-walled huts of timber and clay, all half sunk into the ever-thawing ground. People moved in silence, their faces hollowed by hunger and soot. The elderly sat wrapped in blankets of sheepskin, unmoving, staring into fires that no longer burned. Children, their eyes too large for their faces, no longer played. They had forgotten how. You joined the others near the communal hearth, where the last bundles of dry brush were being carefully rationed. A pot of something than gruel, mostly water, and a few roots was being stirred slowly over a fire that barely held. One of the elders handed you a bowl, not because they had extra, but because it was your turn. You sipped it in silence, the warmth fleeting, and the taste non-existent. The chief, a man with a beard gone patchy from malnutrition, stood and spoke softly. The herds had moved west. No one had seen a full flock of sheep in months. The traders who once passed through bearing news and salt and stories had vanished into the murk. Some said the plague had taken them. Others said they'd seen demons in the smoke. You did not believe in demons, but you no longer believed in sunrises either. The children of the steppe were once nomads, riders of horses, masters of the wind. Now you are wraiths wandering from empty place to empty place, following rumors of green lands and warmth like moths chasing a cold flame. Later that day, you joined a scouting party. 5 of you rode out, bundled and armed with short bows and curved sabers dulled by time. You traveled westward, hoping to find a spring that hadn't dried or a patch of lichen that the goats could chew. The horses plodded, heads low, hooves silent on the frozen soil. Every tree you passed looked burned or dying. The rivers ran shallow and black, choking on ash. By evening, you found a half-buried ruin perhaps, an old watchpost from a forgotten empire. The bricks were blackened, and moss grew from every crevice, but there was shelter there. You made camp inside. There was a moment, as the fire caught final, that you almost felt something like peace. One of your companions, an older man with missing teeth, began to hum an old tune, something about horses and summer rains. The words had been forgotten, but the melody lingered. That night, you dreamt of the sun, not as it was now dull and colorless, but blazing in gold. In your dream, it poured across the hills in sheets of warmth. The grass was green. The sky was blue. You saw your family, laughing under the open sky, faces upturned. You tasted honey. Then you woke up. The cold had crept into your bones. The fire was nearly out. The sky outside remained unchanged gray, endless and low. You stood and stretched, every joint aching, and prepared to ride again. There were more hills to search, more streams to test, more disappointments waiting in the silence. As you rode back the next morning, you passed a field of bones, horses maybe, or deer, or something else. You didn't stop to check. There was nothing to gain from knowing. You looked at the bones, then at your mare, and tried not to do the math. Back at camp, another child had died, quietly, in the night. She had stopped breathing. No one wailed, no one screamed. Her mother just sat beside her, rocking slowly, murmuring old lullabies to ears that no longer heard. The elders burned sage. The chief said nothing. Neither did you. The world was no longer a place of stories. It was a place of survival, and even that felt more like delay. But still you lived. Still, you woke each morning. Still, you watched the horizon. And sometimes, when the mist cleared for just a moment, you thought you saw the light beginning to change. Okay, let's step out of the story for a second. What in the world was actually going on? For centuries, this was a total mystery. But now, thanks to some seriously cool science, we know the culprit. Scientists have drilled these massive ice cores from glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica. These cores are amazing. They act like a frozen, year-by-year timeline of Earth's atmosphere. And when they looked at the layer for 536 CE, they found the smoking gun. A huge spike in sulfate particles. That's the unmistakable signature of a massive volcanic eruption. In 2018, a team pinpointed the source. A huge eruption in Iceland in early 536. It basically blew its top and ejected a massive veil of ash and sulfur high into the stratosphere, which then spread out and wrapped itself around the northern hemisphere like a blanket. It literally blocked the sun, but it gets worse. The ice cores showed that this wasn't a one-off event. It was a catastrophic 1-2-3 punch. There was another massive eruption in 540, likely the Ilopango volcano in El Salvador, and then another one in 547. This triple whammy is what kicked off a century-long cold snap that scientists now call the Late Antique Little Ice Age. So that dense, dry fog everyone wrote about, it wasn't fog. It was a stratospheric veil of volcanic aerosols reflecting sunlight back into space. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Tree rings from all over the world, from California to Siberia, show that trees barely grew at all during these years. The entire foundation of the food chain was starved of light. So the darkness eventually lifts, but the world it reveals is forever changed. That period of cold and chaos, kicked off in 536, lasted for decades and completely altered the course of history. The Byzantine Empire, which under Emperor Justinian was on the verge of reuniting the old Roman Empire, that dream is dead. They were crippled by the famine and then decimated by the plague that followed. This event helped create the final split between the West and the East. And those Norse myths about Fimbulwinter, the 3 terrible years of winter before Ragnarok, the end of the world, a lot of historians now believe this catastrophe is the origin of that story. For the people who lived through it, it must have truly felt like the end of all things. It's a chilling reminder of how fragile our civilization is, how dependent we are on a planet that doesn't always play nice. But it's also a story of incredible resilience. People survived, they adapted, they rebuilt. It's a testament to how unbelievably tough we are when we're put to the ultimate test. So what do you think? How would our modern world, with all our supply chains and technology, cope with an 18-month period of global twilight and crop failure? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Stay curious, and remember the resilience that's coded into our shared human story.